How's it going, everyone? Welcome to another video on the asynchronicity and concurrency in JavaScript. So, we are here because we want to make sure that understand this inner mechanism of how now promise work, as well as the asynchronous patterns that allow to now work with this task that overlaps at a time. So, because of that, thanks to Kyle Simpson, which is the teacher, the instructor of today's course, and something that we're gonna take notes out of that course. Here we so far we have so far we have looked at parallel and synchronicity. What is the subtle difference from the human and computer perspective, and then look at what are the patterns that allow us to actually handle is not parallelism, is concurrency, especially as we write JavaScript applications that are running on a single thread, whether it's on the web or the server. In our case, that is running on top of the web. And how now the web provides us is this particular thing called callbacks that allows us to defer, or in other words, is to make the continuation of our programs at some point in the future, right? So by delegating this portion of the code to them, in this case to the platform, the web platform, using these timers, there's some trade-off of that, because one of the problems is this thing known as inversion control. That is this piece of code that you're passing to this callback, which is the way of how can we express the continuation of our program at X amount of time. By putting them in control of how and when that code will run, that generates us is some trust issue, especially when you're using a third-party libraries. So for example, you don't want to these codes trigger too few times, too many times, not too early, not too fast, without losing the context and keeping up the errors. So all of this kind of thing, this is a list of things that you want to assume, and you want to get out of that. So even though that you can do a work with callbacks to handle all of this asynchronous tasks, the thing here is that when we need to express more complex scenarios in our asynchronous programming, so for example, now when we have to deal with multiple things that can happen concurrently, or things in parallel that can happen concurrently, which means is that things that can happen at the same time, and when you do that, you need to actually manage and coordinate there's this concurrency, this way of how they're going to reply. So for example, when you're making several requests to a particular endpoint, how you're going to now is first wait for them to load, coordinate its response, respond as soon as they are available, and show them in the proper order to the user as they call them. And because this is not a trivial thing, there has been some sort of solutions with callbacks, non-fixes that they call. So you have, hey, well, it's going to pass now is 2 callbacks here. That was a terrible idea. Glad that doesn't actually grasp on. Then it's going to pass now a callback that has the first argument as an error, the error style, which is something that we are using a lot in our Node.js application. Also, we have now this nested callback, right? To actually work with previous data or this time-dependent data. Now, again, as I mentioned before, not only that this introduces this inversion control, but also is they are not reasoned about. Why is that? Because now the moment that you started to define nested call, or that you need a data that depend of another and another and another, that's when you, especially you define all of those continuation of our code in several files, you need to do all of this non-local jump, which of course it becomes now quite cumbersome to deal with. And also they are not reasoned about because it doesn't work the way how our brain works in this concurrent blocking way of reason or planning our code. So there are some proposals, all right, of how can we deal with that. So one of them is thunks, which is this nice little technique in programming that is, hey, let me now wrap that particular function that has everything that it needs to, okay, with let me wrap a function. So let me now wrap a function that has everything that it needs to, that by the time I call them, I get the value of it. So this becomes now a container across our entire application. This token that we, anytime that we call it, we can get the value out of that. So when we talk in the asynchronous, when we meet, from the asynchronous perspective, now this thunk is a, hey, again, this is a function that I want to get this value of, but instead of getting synchronous, I have to wait for that. And by the time that is done, okay, I'm gonna pass a callback to get the value out of it. And this is huge because one of the value proposition of thunks is allowing us to coordinate is all of this promise or all of this requests without worrying about time. So we eliminate time as a concerning factor of this. And this is the value proposition of thunks, is that, hey, now this particular token that is time independent to get the value of. So using closures, thunks now keep a state of this, and by the time that is done, that is resolved, well, we're going to get that value here. This is something interesting because this thunks, even though that this doesn't solve the problem of inversion control, but it solves one of the problematic thing in programming, which is time. Eliminate time as a concerning factor in our code, so we don't have to worry about it. That's good. That's good. That's pretty good. And we also look at a particular example of how can we do that with thunks. How interesting thunks. How interesting is to work with thunks, especially to handle this coordination problem. All right. However, because this is something that Redux behind the scenes is using, okay? Sorry. because now Redux, this is the thing that is using behind the scenes as a way to actually is coordinate all of this asynchronous operations. So anytime we use is async thunk, that's exactly what we are creating. We are creating a wrapper around a value. So by the time that value is available, now we pass a callback to actually get the value out of that. And it's using behind the scenes is closure. So with this understanding, which is why I open it, now let's go to take a look into this video about the promise, okay? And from this conceptual perspective, and also as a way using some of the 2 or 3 metaphors, or using some of the 2 or 3 examples by way of metaphors to actually get that, despite that this can be a silly examples. But the point is, the point here, but the point of this is, oh my God, sorry. But the point of this is to now be able to describe, even for casual stuff, casual things. So that's also another reason why I'm doing this, because I want to describe these casual things that happen or that can happen in my life. Okay. So yeah, we're gonna talk about is promise. Okay. And how now promise. What is the value proposition of promise, which is, well, is a wrapper. Okay. So so the promise becomes is a placeholders or a container wrapper around a value. Okay. But the point of this is to understand now, and in my case is be able to describe these 2 or 3 explanations by way of metaphor and illustration. Why is this? Because it is important to understand why promises are so important, okay, and what is the value proposition of this. Even though they are not perfect, and that you're gonna find that a lot of the time when you actually type in these kind of things, but they are the most important advance in the JavaScript community that has made encodifying reasonable, oh yeah, here we go, encodifying reasonable asynchronous coding pattern. All right. So, but here's a silly metaphor, right? So I walk up to a counter. I walk up to the counter of my favorite pizza restaurant, and then sorry, I walk up to the counter to my favorite pizza restaurants, right? And I order a chili pizza. I really love chili pizza here in Argentina. They are lovely, especially in a place known as El Cuartito. It's wonderful. So I asked her, I like to have a chili pizza. So I asked the lady. So let me begin here because I want to recap this. All right. This is the silly example, okay? So I walk up to so I walk up to the counter Yep. So I walk up to the counter of my favorite pizza restaurant, El Cuartito, and I asked the lady. Yeah, and I and I asked the lady. I like to. Yeah, and I asked the lady. I like a chili pizza, right? So she say, well, that'll be $10.41. Good. So I hand over the money. And so I began a transaction. So I began. Yeah, I handed over the money, and then I began the transactions. So by ordering and giving 10.49, so what is expecting out of this? My chili pizza, but oftentimes you're not handing it the chili pizza right now. So what I'm getting instead? So what instead I'm giving? What I'm instead exactly? This particular phrases is quite interesting. What am I? What instead am I giving? Well, a receipt. And the important thing of this is that it got a number on that. So my order say is 317. So I take that receipt, and my order number has becomes a placeholder. My order number has becomes a placeholder for my future chili pizza. So it is an IOU. So it is a promise for my future pizza chili. For my future chili pizza. So they own me. Exactly. So they own me is a chili pizza because I hand over the money and I start a transaction. But that doesn't mean that I started to thinking about or dreaming. That doesn't mean that I started to think or dream about my future chili pizza. And I can begin to think about that in my mind and start when to do that. So I can begin. Sorry, deeply sorry. So I can begin to think about it, and my mind start to salivate. Okay, so I can begin to think about it, and my mind start to salivate, and thinking about dancing pizzas here around. So I'm famished, and I can't wait to eat it. I'm famished. That particular word is a way of how you can describe that. It's a way of how you can describe that. I'm famished. I really love it, man. I'm famished. Yeah, I'm famished. I'm famished. Holy moly. So I'm famished and I can wait for it. So I have something in my hand, okay, that allow me to reason about that. That allow me to reason about that I'm not having in it. So this is something interesting in terms of working with this silly example, right? Because this number, okay, and then those magical order 317, and then those magical order 317, and then those magical orders, and then those magical order, and then those magical numbers, and then those magical numbers are announced. and then those magical numbers, 317, are announced. Then I walk back to the counter, receiving hands, order 317, order 317, print on it, and then I hand over my receipt, and what I get in return. Now I'm exchanging the promise for the value. So the promise or the codification. So the promise is the codification of the idea. Yeah, the promise is the codification of the idea that we eliminate time as a concerning factor around we eliminate time as a concern wrapper around a value. This is the whole premise of promises, is that we don't care about when the thing is going to resolve. That is something that we delegate that to this promise to know. Is like, hey, when this will happen, for how long we have to wait, and when do we need this. I don't want to wait too long for this, and I want to also do this not too many times, not too slow, not too fast. So all of this, we abstract the complexity of this into this promise that now will act as a container of our value, right? So we need a container about it. In programming, this is called future value, and it is a value that at some point in future we'll get that. But in the meantime, we want to reason about it like a pizza order in a restaurant, because we don't want to sit around and wonder and have all of these forks of different logics, which make our code hard to understand, read, and to debug. So promise becomes a container around a value. And this promise comes primarily not in JavaScript, but for a language called E. So once the members of the TC39 commit, Mark Miller, shout out to Mark Miller, man, the creator of the E language, and they have these things called features. So in E, you can work with that feature value, like that's there, exactly like that there, and perform some operation despite that the value is not there. They call these future values, and we don't get quite the same thing in JavaScript, but it's very powerful in E, right? It quite sounds to functional programming, since what we want to reason about getting values and composing values ignorant of time. And this is something interesting, because the vast majority of things that has provided us value, it comes from the mathematical words. It comes from this functional programming, right? That's interesting. Even though that we have now these things called object programming, which is more a philosophy rather than it's a philosophy to compose its data and its functionality together, right? And they have some sort of constraint as a way to make this particular application work as expected without any side effect. That's why we have these solid principles and blah 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 blah, right? So yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. So by the time here that we are using now the functional programming concept, that is like a monad. So promises are basically a monad. Is a function that has everything that it needs. It defines some sort of rule of how can we interact with this data inside of that. and also some rules as a way to how you can update the data here. Again, this is something that perhaps go beyond the scope of today's video and the functional programming, but it's interesting actually to describe this promise with this silly example, okay? Using these 2 or 3 explanations by way of metaphor and illustration as a way to understand that all of these different sequences that are happening. Okay. Wait a second. Wait a second. Wait a second. Wait a second. Ooh, okay, wait. Oh, that's good. That's good. Oh, that's good. That's good. Okay. Just to briefly describe here with a silly example with promises, is that just as a way to understand that a little bit more, that even though that this is not perfect, because you're gonna find a lot of gotchas, and you can also create these things like promise hell, okay, similar like the callback here. But the thing here is so far one of the most advantages that we have in the JavaScript community when it comes to describe or encodify reasonable asynchronous coding pattern. Describe reasonable asynchronous coding pattern. Okay? And this is important because so far with callbacks, how do you describe that asynchronicity, and also to wait for, and also when it comes to wait for that data to come back here, you know, it's something that is quite not reason about it, for the thing that I already mentioned before. But now with promise, it's so far, and then we're gonna see is this async and await thing that is using generators behind the scenes as a way to truly understand that, right? How this thing works, because once we gain this knowledge about the asynchronous and how the things work, about the promise and how the things work behind the scenes, a lot of the time we're going to now understand how this we're going to align our mind to how the JavaScript work, particularly using this asynchronous coding or this asynchronous coding pattern. And a lot of the time that will make our code much more reason about it, especially when we look other code from the past or from someone else, and you'll see that some of them might not get it. And all right, so this silly example start by I walk back. I walk up to the counter of my favorite restaurant to order a chili pizza. In my case, here is on the El Cuartito. And I asked the lady, I'd like to have a chili pizza. So she say, that'll be $10.49. Okay, so I hand over the $10. I hand over the $10.49. Okay, so I begin a transaction by ordering and giving us the money. So I'm expecting. So what I'm expecting out of this is my pizza, but oftentimes you don't get that. Exactly. But often I'm not handed a chili pizza. What am I exactly? I'm not handling a chili pizza. What instead I am getting? What instead am I given? This is something interesting. This. What instead am I given? What am I getting for? You know, what instead I am given? Exactly. What instead I am given? Similar for what am I getting from this? What am I getting from this? And what instead am I given? This is quite interesting here. What instead am I given? You know, what instead am I given? A receipt. The more importantly, it has a number on it. Order 370, right? So I take the receipt, okay, and my number has become now a placeholder. And in the Spanish, this particular word is quite interesting because has become this lugar temporal o espacio temporal, these placeholders for my future chili pizza. All right. So this has become, so this receipt with an old or this receipt and my order number has become is a placeholder, lugar temporal for my chili pizza. So this is an IOU. This is an IOU. It is a promise of my future chili pizza. So they owe me a chili pizza because exactly. So they owe me a chili pizza because I hand over the money and I start a transaction. If you then I start the money and then I start a transaction by handing over the money. In this case, it is money, but in the programming concept is by creating this object. But in any case, let's move on here. So that doesn't mean that I'm starting to think and dream about my future chili pizza. And when I do that, my mind starts to salivate and thinking about dancing pizzas here, there, and I'm famished. So I can wait to eat it. So I have something in my mind that allow me to reason about something that I'm not having it. This is this is interesting. This receipt is allow me to dream to something that I don't have in it. So similar like with the pizza or all of this, perhaps wonderful woman. You can also think of that. So for example, so for example this, all right. So all of this image, that doesn't mean that I'm starting to, okay. That's a good one. That's definitely a good one. That's definitely a good one. That's definitely a good one. Yeah, that's definitely a good one. That's definitely a good one. No, I will stick with that image. You know, I will stick with that emotion with that image. Okay. Yep. Yeah, completely. Exactly. 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 Yep. Yep. I'll go for her. For her. I'll go for her. Absolutely. 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 Even though that I'm not a big fan of this, but I will go for it, right? That doesn't mean that I'm starting to think about. That's exactly what I did. So that doesn't mean that I that doesn't mean that I don't have that okay. So that doesn't mean that I don't start to think about. That doesn't mean that I don't start to think or dream about pizzas, and when I do that, my mind starts to salivate and begin to think of all of this pizza dancing. You know, relative woman, and famished, and I can't wait to eat it. Right. So I have something in my mind. So I have something in my hand that allow me to reason about something that I don't have. Okay. So and then those magical order, and then those magical numbers 317 are announced. Then I walk back to the counter, receive my hand, order 317 printed on it, and I hand over the receipt. And what I get and what I receive in return, now I'm exchanging the promise for the value, for the pizza, right? So this particularly silly example of something that you can now, and something that we do in our everyday life, okay, as a way to make sense of this, and also being able to describe this particular thing called promise. which back in the 80 when promise was introduced, of promise, because promise here was something interesting. Promise, yeah, promise. Promise is from yeah, when promise was introduced 2015. Holy moly. As an official API in the CommonJS, mailing this. All right, interesting. Very, very, very interesting. Interesting. Very, very interesting. 2016. In 2009. What is the lineage of this idea of promise? It all starts with thongs, and then with futures, dual channels, e-language. Okay, mock-it. That's very interesting here. Promise explosion, Dojo defer, jQuery defer, A plus origin, failed async proposal, and then it becomes to ES 2015. That's quite interesting, man. That's very, very interesting. Mercury Space Program. A thong is a piece of code which provides an address when executed, it leaving some standard location. Each formal parameter of a function is bound to a separate process. Each formal parameter of a function is bounded to a separate process called future. Okay, and a process, if we remember for computer science, is this particularly place, or is this independent program with its own memory. Okay. Interesting. Dojo defer, the Q awakening. Briar patch of API, web crypto, fetch index DB. Interesting, very, very interesting. Promise landed in ES 2015 by TC39 committed. Very, 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 very interesting. So, again, because the challenge here is how do we handle, and this is something that, for example, Redux, Saga is trying to achieve, right? It's like, how do we now handle is this asynchronicity of this concurrency, all of these tasks that overlaps at a time when it comes to actually update our state. Oh my God. That's quite interesting. And that's what the using is now behind the scene is, well, the concept of generators and that kind of thing. That go beyond the scope of this, but the TLDR of all of this is that now we have a way of to describe how can we represent a promise in real life. Okay, so not only that, is because we can now abstract that from the real world to our language. or to our code, because at the end of the day, this promises is the codifications of an idea of eliminated. This promise is a codification of a is this so promise is this idea of the need for a placeholders. It's a codification here, but the promise is a codification of this idea of that we need a placeholders to eliminate time conserve wrapping around a value. This is the placeholder, is temporal. In the Spanish, this is un lugar temporal que elimine el tiempo de la consideración a la hora de obtener el valor. As a concern wrap around a value. So, yeah, this is. Oh my God! Let me do something. JavaScript. Yeah, because it's like, how do you have that? And again, I'm here is thanks to the showing of giants, of all of these people that actually have took the time, every effort, the dedication to solve their own problems, and now I can use that. Right. But I am not understanding is a challenge that I am hearing, and that's what I want. That's the reason why I'm doing this. That's the reason why am I doing this. Okay. So, after that quick recap, right? Of promise and what promise is, especially by using a metaphor with 2 or 3 explanations, I feel way much better to talk about. Oh my God, yeah, I need those things that allow me to relieve my nose from those grip. So, Jesus, yeah, I totally feel better. Oh my God. Oh my God. Jesus. Mm-hmm. Jesus. This promise things, okay, which is a way of how can we now is codifying is here we know her promise is a so promise is the idea, okay, so promise is the idea of codifying. Yeah, promise is the promise is a container, or promise is the codification. So promise is the codifications around so promise is the codifications around an idea that we need a placeholder to eliminate time concern wrapper around a value. So it means that these placeholders that we don't care of how do we get that value, we're gonna get, the only thing that we care is that we're gonna get that at some point in the future. So by describing is this silly story and this silly example of when you go to your restaurant, to your favorite restaurant. In my case, I go to the counter of my favorite restaurant. It's a pizza restaurant, and I want chili pizza. So I asked the lady, "Hey, I like to have a chili pizza." So she said, "Well, that'll be $10.49." So I hand over the money, and I began a transaction here. So instead of getting the pizza right now, often you get, So instead of getting the pizza right now, I'm not handing the chili pizza right now. What instead I'm getting? What instead am I given? A receipt with an order number. Exactly, a receipt with an order number on it, which is the most important things, 370, that will represent now a placeholder, which is a temporary place, okay? It becomes a placeholder for my future chili pizza. So it is like an IOU from the restaurants, and it is a promise of the future chili pizza. So that doesn't mean that even though that they owe me a chili pizza, and I hand over because I hand over the money and they start and then I started a transactions. That doesn't mean that I don't can. That doesn't mean that I don't. That I don't. That doesn't mean that I. Yeah, that doesn't mean that I'm starting to thinking about this pizza and dancing and all of this pizzas around my head. And when I do that and start to salivate that. Yeah, when I do that, I start to salivate and thinking pizza dancing is around me, right? So I'm famished. I can't wait to eat it. This particular phrase, I'm famished. I can't wait to eat it, right? So I have something in my hand, this recipe that allow me to think about something that I don't even have. And that's something quite interesting. This is how also now stock auctions and that kind of thing is that I'm starting to think about something and dream about something that I don't have that, right? This is a feature, a promise. So then those magical numbers 317 or 317 are announced. So I walk back to the counter, receive at hand with the order number 317 printed on it, and then I exchange that promise, this placeholder, for the future value. So despite that this can be a silly example, the whole point of this is that now we have is these placeholders that eliminate time for our concerns, that eliminate time for our concerns, so we know that we're gonna get that thing. So in the context, this is also something that a lot of people, when they go out to restaurants or a bank, they receive this particularly bank order or waiting ticket list, waiting list ticket that indicates like, hey, you will be at hand by this particular amount of time. Okay, so that's great, that's good. But the idea here is that now when you bring that to the programming language, to JavaScript, is that this is now this, it represents, the promise is a codifications of the idea that we needed this placeholder to eliminate time as a concern to eliminate time concern wrapping around a value, right? So this is something that comes from one of the TC39 group commit, or the TC39 commit, Mark Miller, which is the author of e-programming, that actually in that programming have this notion of this future value. That's how they call it. But this allows us to reason about that we're gonna get values and compose that. And if you can imagine, all of these concepts come from the functional programming, and that is what that's something that allows to build this all of applications in a way that is make much more sense. in a way that is provide much more sense when we write this kind of code. So before talking to the API, it is important to understand what is the problem that the promises are solving or solve. All right, is this notion of that we don't want to care about when this data we're gonna get. You just wanna get that, and I want to use a placeholders to get that value. So these codifications of this idea that we need this placeholder to eliminate time concern wrapping around a value, which is, you may wonder, okay, what is different from thunks? All right, so let's get into it.
Listener back from the track checkout function.
Okay. That's right. Promises, and then you got it. Promise API. Promise API. Okay, native promises. Oh, this is when you say is native promises. Okay, native promises. And then promises API. So what is the difference of thunks, or what is the problem promise solve? Because at the end of the day, we got our, so what's the problem? So what's the problem promise solve? Because at the end of the day, we got thunks for that.
So back to our track checkout, if you recall from before, that silly scenario about the e-commerce. And rather than passing my callback in, what if we were to modify that API such that it returned back an event listener to us? As you see on line 11, I listened to
the completion event. With a single moment. Exactly.
Then a callback and pass it to someone else, I give them the continuation control, and now I've inverted the control that I had. But what if we could uninvert that paradigm? If we could uninvert, or rather not invert it in the first place, rather than passing a callback to a utility, what if we could say something like, I'm going to call some function, and I know it.
Exactly. So instead, exactly. So instead of passing a callback, okay, to a function, So instead of passing a callback to a function, which effectively exactly. So instead of passing a callback to a function, okay, just like we did with our callbacks or thunks, okay, what we don't is now have an object.
Say something like, I'm going to call some function, and I know it might take a while for it to finish, rather not invert it in the first place, rather than passing a callback to a utility. What if we could say something like, I'm going to call some function, and I know it might take a while for it to finish. I want you to return to me, when I call you utility, I want you to give me back something. I want you to give me an event listener. An event listener.
Exactly. So instead of passing a callback to a function, just like we did with our callbacks or thunks, why we don't have something that by the time that is done, okay, by the time that is done, we we now
listener
run this.
to finish. I want you to return to me. When I call you utility, I want you to give me back something. I want you to give me an event listener. And
Exactly. So by the time that is done, I want you to give me an event listener. Listener.
event listener that I can subscribe to a completion event.
So that listener that I can subscribe to a list, exactly, that listener that I can subscribe to a that listener that I can subscribe to an event.
Utility, I want you to give me back something. I want
To
you
a
to give me
complete
an
event.
An event listener that I can subscribe to a completion event.
So that listener that I can subscribe to a completion event.
So I'll listen for the completion event, and you just fire that event whenever you're good and ready, and I'll be notified through this event listener that you finished your work, and I'll know it's time to move on. In fact, in addition to being a completion event, I could also listen to an error event. If you had some error, to notify me or...
So I can comply exactly, but it's exactly what it's doing here is that, hey, instead of having to pass a callback to this, so whatever you give me is now a listener that I can subscribe to a completion event.
Or finished your work, and I'll know it's time to move on. In fact, in addition to that event, and I know it might take a while for it to finish, I want you to return to me. When I call you utility, I want you to give me back something. I want you to give me an event listener. An event listener that I can subscribe to a completion event. So I'll listen for the completion event, and you just fire that event whenever you're good.
So I can subscribe to a listener event, so you can fire whenever you are ready to, exactly, so you can, whoever mechanism is doing that,
I'll be notified through this event.
So you can fire whenever you are ready, and I'll be notified when that is ready.
Listener, that you finished your work, and I'll know it's time to move on.
Exactly. So I can subscribe to this listener event, which is, after all, the thing is subscribing you to this listener event. Holy moly. So you can fire whenever you are ready, and I'll be notified when that's ready. So I can move on to whatever I need to do.
In fact, in addition to being a completion event, I could also listen to an error event. If you had some error, to notify me, or other things that you wanted to notify.
So if you have an error event, I can subscribe to that and trigger something like that.
Me about. I could simply receive an event listener back from you, and I know that's a tried and true pattern to receive something and listen to it. Listen, subscribe to events on it.
So I can subscribe to the trigger. So I can subscribe to that and trigger. If you have an error event, so I can subscribe to that and trigger for it.
So back to our track checkout, if you recall from before, that silly scenario about the e-commerce. Rather than passing my call back in, what if we were to modify that API such that it returned back an event listener to us? As you see on line 11, I receive a listener back from the track checkout function, and then on line 13, I listen to the completion event. And when it finishes, I move on. And I listen to the error event, and when it finishes, I move on. Can you see how that is uninverted the inversion of control, or rather just simply retained control? Because now, rather than passing my call back into that utility, giving
So this, as you can see, it invert. So as you can see, this is a listener here. Interesting.
Them the keys to the kingdom by which they can do whatever they want, and I can't trust that they won't do what I don't expect. I've retained control. I simply said, no, you give me an event listener. I'll figure out what to do. I'll listen for that event.
So we now here get the control back by saying, hey, just give me a listener that I can subscribe, and by the time you are ready, okay, that it can subscribe. By the time you are ready, well, yeah. So by the time you are ready, yeah. So give me a listener that I can subscribe. By the time you are ready, calls that.
And we could wire it such that we listen for the event and then unsubscribe to the event the first time it happens, for example. Like, we are in complete control of that paradigm.
So you can subscribe, and by the time you are ready, I can do the thing that I needed. So by having this listener here,
such that we listen for the event and then unsubscribe to the event the first time it happens, for example. Like, we are in complete control of that paradigm. So we've normalized, we've brought more sanity back to this process rather than passing the callback in. That's an important understanding of promises, is that they uninvert the inversion of control problem. That's a big deal. That's not.
So they invert this. So promise inverted the. So promise solve the inversions of control by providing a placeholder with listeners that we can now by providing a placeholder with listeners that we can now subscribe to it. So we now have much more control about when this happened.
Not a small point. That's one of the most important points. Promises were designed to uninvert that inversion of control, or rather to retain that control, so that all of those trust issues that we were talking about before have an ordered and patterned way of being solved. Now, we don't actually listen this way. This isn't how most APIs are designed, although it's an established pattern that we can at least understand, but it's a metaphor for thinking about a promise. A promise is like an event listener.
So promise solve the inversion control by providing a placeholder with listeners that we can now subscribe to. A promise is an event listener. A promise is an event listener.
But rather than there being a completion event, we call that event the then event. And that's where we start to talk about the API of a promise. So in that checkout utility, rather than receiving a callback as a parameter, we can simply create a promise. As you see on line 2, I'm constructing a promise instance. The constructor for the promise receives two methods, the resolve and the reject. It's pretty clear what those do by the way I've named them. You call resolve if you want to resolve the promise, if you want to fulfill it completely or correctly, and you call reject if you need to reject the promise. Back to my future cheeseburger, those are the only two options. Either I'm eventually going to get my cheeseburger, or the lady's going to call me back up to the counter and say, this is a tragedy, but we are completely out of cheeseburgers. I'm going to have to give you your money back. These are the only two options, right? Either I get my cheeseburger or I get my money back. So we can either fulfill a promise, calling resolve, or we can reject it. Those are the only two outcomes that a promise can have. So whatever
that I
that
can get my
magic is,
money
I'm
back here.
eliding that information because that isn't the important part, but whatever that logic is inside of track checkout, it either needs to call resolve or reject. Now, you notice that we're returning that promise instance. So when we return that promise instance, we're going to use it in our code. Just like I'm doing here on line 11, I receive a promise back, and then notice how line 13, instead of saying .on completion, I'm saying .then. I'm registering for the then event. The then event is going to be called when either resolve or reject is fired against that promise. It will fire the then event, if you will, metaphorically, and one of those two functions passed into it's going to get called. Finish will be called if the promise was fulfilled successfully, error if it was rejected. So we have actually a nice, clean mechanism for being notified that it was either a success or that it was a failure. It's an incredibly important step forward for uninversion.
Exactly. So we have now a mechanism in.
It was either a success or that it was a failure. It's an incredibly important. So, and one of those two functions passed into it's going to get called. Finish will be called if the promise was fulfilled successfully, error if it was rejected.
We have a mechanism in.
So we have actually a nice, clean mechanism for being notified that it was either a success.
Mm-hmm. Solve the inversion control by providing a placeholder with listener that we can subscribe to. A promise and event listener. Exactly. A promise and event listener. A mechanism. A mechanism that we can subscribe to.
Error if it was rejected. So we have actually a nice, clean mechanism for being notified that it was either a
a mechanism to get notified when something is done or not.
Success or that it was a failure.
A mechanism to get notified when something is success or a failure. But it's this one. But it's a mechanism to get notified about that, which is at the end of the day, is an event listener.
It's an incredibly important step forward for uninversion of inversion of control. Inversion of control is sometimes used in an intentional way. Framework design authors sometimes will use, in fact, inversion of control is one of the key characteristics that has classically been used to define something as a framework, is when it inverts control. When you pass in stuff and it calls it for you instead of you calling things. I don't know how many of you are familiar with some of those more classical thinkings about software design, but that's one of the characteristics that divides between a library and a framework, is that inversion of control. So some people will tell you that inversion of control is an intentional design feature, and I would tell you, as far as asynchronicity is concerned, it's a terrible idea. Inversion of control is the path to the dark side here. It is the path by which we completely lose all reasonability in our program. So we are trying intentionally, actively, on purpose, to uninvert that paradigm, to bring it back into our control. That's what promises are doing for us. See, this isn't actually about an API at all. This isn't about, lack of indentation. In fact, if you pay close attention, you notice there's still a ton of callbacks here. In fact, there's more callbacks here than there were before. Wait a minute. Hold up. The promises were all about solving callback hell, getting rid of callbacks. How on earth are they fixing anything if there's still callbacks involved? Really important question. If there's still callbacks involved, how does this promise system offer any solutions to us? You might ask, and rightly so, well, wait, if I pass my callback into that promise, can't the promise just call my callback a bunch of times? How can I trust the promise to do what it's supposed to do? That's the most important question that can be asked at this point. Because you need to understand that promises were designed to instill trust into this transaction. The fundamental design principle.
To install trust.
Only resolved once.
To install trust into this transaction.
Promise system offer any solutions to us? You might ask, and rightly so, well, wait, if I pass my callback into that promise, can't the promise just call my callback a bunch of times? How can I trust the promise?
How can I...
Can't the promise just call my callback a bunch of times? How can I trust the promise to do what it's supposed to do? That's the most important question that can be asked at this point. Because you need to understand that promises were designed to instill trust into this transaction. The fundamental design principle. That they're only resolved once. They can only be resolved as a success or an error. The messages that get passed to a promise are always kept. It becomes immutable. Exceptions are always caught and turned into errors that are always observable. There's nothing swallowed. If you choose not to observe because you're lazy or you make a mistake, then it might look like it was swallowed, but it definitely was not swallowed in the sense that you had no opportunity to observe it. This is a huge deal. This is a whole bunch of sanity brought back to a process that has fundamentally been rather hard to understand and rather hard to maintain for the entirety of JavaScript's history. So herein we do start to see some of the benefits of the API. These are things above and beyond this notion of time-independent state. I said that was important. That's our foundation. Built upon that, we have all of this trust added to it, and that is primarily the mechanism in the API that we've been given is designed to organize our callbacks in that certain way. In fact, you might think of it, a third way of thinking about what a promise is that it's a callback manager. It's a pattern for managing our call.
It's a callback manager. Another thing to think about is another thing to think about it is that a promise is a callback manager. Because it solves the problem of this. It solved this problem, which is now installed is a. Because now it installed is this one. The fuck yeah, you think you're doing? Now, promise install this trust that when using callbacks we lack of. So now promise install this trust that when using callback we lack of. So trigger not too fast, not too slow, not too many times, not too few times, no, not lost context in handling errors.
Callbacks in a trustable fashion. That's a big deal. That's why promises matter. It's not really so much about whether you like the shiny API or not. It's not really about whether you want to get rid of nesting or indentation. There's a promise hell, and it's easy to get into. There's no silver bullet. But there's a really important thing that they've been designed to do, that is to instill trust back into our systems. Even more than just trust in this way, now that my value is immutable, I marked that one on purpose because now
they are to install trust in our system that, hey, this is gonna do this, not anything. So it doesn't open the Pandora box here to say, hey, now it's gonna do this and this, and depending on the use case, like no. It actually now provides this callback manager mechanism. It's this mechanism of how now we are going to listen to those events or listen to the data that is listen to whether the data is available or not.
That my value is immutable. From the outside, it cannot be changed. That means I can send that container to any port of my system, or even outside of my system, to other third parties. And I can say, here is my value, and I do not have to worry that they're going to change that value out from underneath me. Remember we talked about immutability in the other workshop and how important that is? That's one of these fundamental important, in fact, one of the most important things is that they're externally immutable. There's no action at a distance concern here. If you don't know that phrase, action at a distance, that's one of the evils of software architecture. When you design
Actions at a distance. Actions at a distance. It's a concept in physics that an object motions can be affected by another object without the two being in physical contact. That is, it's the concept of non-local interactions of objects that are separating in space. Coulomb's law and Newton's law, universal gravitation, are based on actions at a distance. Oh, shit. Historically, action at a distance was the early scientific model for gravity and electricity. Okay, and it continued to be useful in many practical cases. In 19th and 20th centuries, Field's model arose to explain these phenomena with more precision. The discovery of electrons and special relativity led to new actions at a distance models, providing an alternative to field theory. Under our modern understanding, the four fundamental interaction, gravity, electromagnetism, the strong interaction and weak interaction, which is these four fundamental interactions. Gravity, electromagnetism, which is actions at a distance. Now we don't know what happened there. Four fundamentals interaction: gravity, electromagnetism, the strong interaction and the weak interaction. The strong interaction is what makes the strong interaction is what keeps the nucleus, the protons, what keeps the protons and protons, neutrons, and protones, neutrones, protones, neutrones y electrones. Exactly. Protons, neutrons, and electrons, right? Is what allows now to make these interactions to be together. Strong interaction, the other is the weak interaction. In all of physics are not described by action at a distance. So actions at a distance, it'll inquire into motions. Anyway, okay, actions at a distance.
design a system where somebody else far away can do something that affects you without you knowing it. It's a bad idea. Just as a little side note here, there are discussions happening around promises that in a future version of JavaScript we can get this notion of a cancelable promise. I'm not going to go into all the politics and all the craziness that's around cancelable promises. Just briefly to state to you, it's kind of a tail wagging the dog as far as I see it. They have the
Tail of the dog.
promises. Just briefly to state to you, it's kind of a tail wagging the dog as far as I see it.
Tail wagging the dog. Oh, tail wagging the dog. Tail wagging the dog. Tail wagging the dog. The tail wagging the dog is used to describe a situation in which an important or powerful person, organization, etc., is being controlled by someone or something that is much less important or powerful. The tail wagging the dog. I get it. The tail wagging the dog, marico. La cola moviendo al perro, así. Not the other way around. The tail wagging the dog. The tail wagging the dog, man.
They have this other sort of thing that they want to control, and that thing that they want to control only exposes promises, and so, let's make promises cancelable so that we can control that thing, instead of making that thing controllable. It's crazy to me. But you know what's bad about cancelable promises? action at a distance. I have a promise that's not yet resolved. I pass it to somebody else and they can cancel it out from underneath me? What? That's nonsense. That erodes the entire foundation upon which these things are built.
Exactly. Erodes the trust here.
So if you see me ranting about cancelable promises, this is why. I take it seriously, because this is an important thing.
Cancelable. Cancelable promises. Oh my God. Okay. Oh no. Okay. Cancelable promise. Cancelable promise. Oh crap. I cancel a promise? Oh, because promises are not cancelable. That's what we have to define is now. That's what we have to. Oh shit. That's what, for example, in the case of React Dev, it says that. Here, when they say, hey, you know what? You want us to handle is this escape hatches, which is now is how do you going to synchronize with external systems, especially fetching data. When they say, hey, let me now is abort the fetch. Let me now is abort the fetch here. Let me know is abort the fetch. Again, this is to handle this specific problem here. So whether is you can use a promise for that or an async. Because now, by the time you actually is running this effect, and for some reason is to clean up this, so it's because if your effect fetch something, that the cleanup function should either abort the fetch or ignore the result. You can undo a network request that already happened, but you can clean up functions should ensure that fetch that's not relevant anymore does not keep affecting your application. If the user ID changes the Alice above cleanup, ensure that Alice responds. If the user ID changes from Alice to Bob, cleanup ensure that Alice response is ignored even if arrived after Bob. But this is this particular issue that we need to handle here, because the way of how React actually mechanism, the way how the React mechanism works here, okay, is by saying, hey, I'm gonna now trigger these async operations, but if you have now several components actually make all of these calls, In this case, if you want, for example, is to abort this operation, this fetching data, or abort the fetch, it's because you have to say, hey, the effect don't run on the server. Fetching directly in effect make it easy to create network waterfall. Fetching directly in effect usually means you don't preload or catch data. It is not very ergonomic because now it creates these race conditions, especially when you need to trigger this when you're waiting for a user to type, all right? When you wait for users to type, race conditions. How do you handle race conditions here? It's quite a bit boilerplate code involved in writing fetch calls in a way that doesn't suffer from bugs like race condition. The list of downside is not specific to React. It applies to fetching data on mount with any library, like with the routing. Data fetching is not trivial to do. So we recommend the following approach: or use a framework or use something like this. So not an effect, buying a product, putting it all together. We can use here as a partial to put all of this. But because we are now passing as a callback here, that I want you to run this and defining here in this is a block, exactly, defining here all of this variables and functions that I'm registering in this. So by the time to have now an ID to actually clean that up, clear the timer out, by the time I get out of these components, which now this will call is one last time when you unmount that. So by the time you mount this, you have now this. Exactly after 3 seconds, you're going to log this one. So by the time the text change here in the text, I think this is something that we already bind that. And now he will trigger the. So by the time now we unmount this component and say, hey, now let me actually is cancel that and clear the timeout ID. So I don't have any memory leaks here. I don't have any timers. I don't have any timers in memory here running. Oh my God, cancelable. Oh, that's not a good idea.
We shouldn't throw it away just because we're drunk on this idea of pretty APIs. So it really is an uninversion of control. Now, there's more to promises than that. And this does start to get a little bit more into how do I use the API. This is normally where people start learning promises. So I'm not neglecting teaching you that part, but you'll notice that I built us a foundation of concept first. Now,
okay. So that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye-bye.